traveling and speaking and inspiring folk, she found time to write a book. And not just a book, but a good book, a thorough book, a book that honestly I read it twice because I was so moved by the stories and by the messages in it. And I'm proud to call her my sister. I'm proud to call her my friend. And I am so excited that she chose to come to Uncle Bobbie's and hang out with us. So please give a warm round of applause to Linda Sarsour. And Corona. So, welcome. Goddamn mic. I'm sorry, can someone grab my book from the back, or any copy? First of all, welcome to Uncle Bobbie's.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited and honored to be. I was telling folks in the back that I'm not usually, I don't get nervous and stuff, but this is very meaningful to me.
It means a great deal to me, and Linda and I get to travel around the country. We end up often at the same events a lot. And when you told me about the book one day, we were in California, I believe, and you said, I want to write a memoir. I was excited for you, but I was also a little bit nervous because there's so many memoirs that are out right now. And sometimes memoirs can be more like branding and infomercials for their next product than a real engagement with somebody's story. So I guess the first thing I wanted to know was why'd you want to write a memoir? Why now?
I appreciate that question. I mean, for me, Mark, it's I don't know how long I'll have on this earth, and I think we all don't know. And I've been through enough things to know that it could be a possibility that my life be limited, and I had to give something and leave something for my family, and leave something for my children and the communities that I come from. For the last few years, there have been people from across the spectrum who have tried to define me, define my convictions, define the communities that I come from. And I said to myself one day, no, I have to define myself. And I have to be able to leave something that someone can pick up. You can define me whatever way you want, but here is my book and this is how I define myself. And so that for me was something that I felt like I owed to my children in particular and to my grandchildren.
So you define yourself in this book in lots of ways. One of the ways you introduce us to you is the very question of hijab, and the very question of what it means to be Muslim. Talk to me about that journey.
For me, growing up, and you'll read more about this in my book, my parents were immigrants to this country. I was the firstborn child, so my parents named me Linda. They actually named me after an Arabic song about a guy who leaves the country to go meet this beautiful girl somewhere. And her name happens to be Linda, so he comes back with a song that is for those of you who speak Arabic, you'll know the song. It's Linda, Linda, ya Linda, Ana bahibbik ya Linda. That was the song. And so my mom named me after that song, and I have dark hair, I have fair skin, and so no one in my community really knew what I was. They didn't know, I had that little Rosie Perez thing going on, so people thought I was I was Linda from the block. I was Puerto Rican sometimes, I was Dominican sometimes, I could be Italian, I could be all kinds of things, but I was never who I actually was. And so for me, hijab started out as a journey towards an identity. And so for me...
How old were you, 19?
I was 19 years old. So for me, hijab was, you may not know I'm Palestinian, but you will know that I'm a Muslim. And that was very important to me to feel like there was something empty inside, something inside of me that just walking out of the world, I didn't want to be ambiguous. I wanted to have something to share. So that was my initial journey into hijab. And then of course, as you grow older and start organizing and you start connecting your hijab to the spirituality that it's actually for. And so for folks in the room that don't understand the concept of hijab, it's very simple. It's the idea of modesty and the idea that I should be judged by my character, judged by my brilliance and what I can contribute to the world, and to be judged by the shallow expectations of Western society. And it's also, for me, hijab is about agency and choice. And that's very important, particularly when you hear conversations around hijab being something oppressive based on the actions of dictatorships like Iran, for example. And so in my book, I make a very clear distinction between people respecting my agency and my choice to wear hijab, and then also condemning the dictatorships that force women to wear hijab. And those two things can be true at the same time. And I think oftentimes people ask us to choose between those things. That for some reason, because I wear hijab, somehow I'm not in solidarity or can't be in solidarity with women who are forced to wear hijab. And then also in my book, I call on people to also be in solidarity with women in places like France, in which the French government, in fact, has passed legislation to ban women, Muslim women, from wearing hijab in public universities and in public sector jobs, and also banning us from wearing long-sleeve bathing suits on the beach. And so for me, and particularly when we talk about feminism, if we're going to be women who stand up for the rights of all women all over the world, I want you to be just as outraged at France for banning women from wearing hijab as you are outraged at countries like Iran who force women to wear hijab. And that's what I call people to in my book.
Another thing you do in the book is you make it a critique of Western feminism, which I think is interesting because you spend a whole lot of time around Western feminists. Talk to me about that. What's that like?
We're trying to open wounds.
Am I moving too fast? We can
too fast for me. I mean, for me, my book, I tried to make it as accessible as possible. So for those of you who get the opportunity to actually read the book or hear my voice on audio, I'm trying to speak to people who may have never heard of any of these concepts and may have heard a whole other story that is not my story or the story of many Muslim women. So oftentimes when you think about, and just thinking about feminism in general, and particularly Western feminism, you probably would never think of an image of someone who looks like me. And the idea for me, about being a movement that represents the plight of women all over the world is that feminism can look like me. It can talk like me, it can dress like me. And that was very important to me, but in the last 20 years, we've watched women, white women in particular, who, in places like Afghanistan, this idea of let's free the Muslim women of their hijab. And that is how you liberate women. The more clothes they take off, the more liberated they are. And I try to address that in a way that is accessible, that to see me and say, okay, I see this now. If she feels liberated in what she chooses to wear, then I'm going to respect that and not impose on her what I believe to be what liberation is. And so for me, my hijab is very liberating to me. It makes me feel powerful. It is, for me, I can walk into any room and that's just who I am immediately the minute that you see me. And it's been hard for me to, in particular in the last few years, as I have been organizing with a lot of white women in particular, who really have never had these conversations before, who have also never been challenged on their views about Muslim women, ever. Yeah. And then here comes a Muslim woman, and not just any Muslim woman, one from Brooklyn too. Right. And I know, I said I'm a lot. But I think those conversations have been really productive and have really moved us in the right direction.
Connected to this question of these stereotypes, because we often, someone said once, I think it was Gary Speed, this idea of white men saving brown women from brown men, and that's sort of how we think about the project of ending oppression and what Western feminism can be and these other things. There's also an idea of what Arab men are like. And when I read the book and I hear about your dad, we've been using the word girl dad a lot lately. It's so fascinating to hear that story and how it challenges our conceptions of who and what Arab fathers are, what Muslim fathers are, and so forth. Talk to me about your dad. Abu Linda.
Abu Linda. Sorry. My dad was diagnosed with cancer last year. So it's been a difficult time. He's doing really well right now. But when Kobe was passed away, I just had the moment to sit, and when I saw that hashtag girl dad, and you'll learn more about this in my book, my dad is the girl dad. My dad has 5 daughters, a man who was brought up in a very patriarchal society, in a society that told him that he has to keep trying to bear that first son, and that somehow one son equals more than 100 girls. And my father, who is not a man of education, he only has a 5th grade education, for him single-handedly to shatter the societal expectations of him as an Arab father, a Palestinian father from a small village in the West Bank of Palestine. And there's imagery in my book where I share like my father coming home from the hospital, so elated, carrying my mom's bag, and he's so excited, and our other Palestinian Yemeni neighbors are like, she must have had a boy this time. And my dad would be like, nope, we had another little bride, and so excited, and people don't think about those simple moments. And my mother had 5 girls in a row. And in fact, when I was 10 years old, so I just want you to visualize this. I'm 10 years old, and my mother already had 7 children, and I was the oldest. So I had 6 siblings who were younger than me, and I was only 10. And that was because my mom kept on trying to have that boy. And my dad at one point tells her, once we had like the 3rd girl, my dad was like, look, just so you know, we live in an apartment in Brooklyn. Like, we don't live on a farm. You need to figure this out. Like, I don't know who you're trying to please here, but I'm good. This is enough. This is joy. And of course, my mom, you know, she was not trying to hear that. And she continued and continued until finally God did give my mom 2 sons. But my father is a man that has taught me so much lessons in life just from being who he is, and being kind and generous. And you know, my dad, I talk about a corner store, and to be honest, like my dad is a stereotype of the Palestinian Arab guy with the corner store in a black neighborhood. Like that was who my father was. Except there was something a little different about him. The way in which he had a relationship with the community, that in which he was literally a business owner for 40 years. So if you think about how long you span over 40 years, you have seen children, grandchildren, and even great-grandchildren. And my father knows you by name. He knows when your mother's supposed to come home from work. He knows to tell you to get yourself in the house because your mom's coming up the block. That was the kind of person that he was in that community. And I share at the end of the book a full circle moment for me with my father, when many of you might have heard this name before, but just last year, there was the murder of a young black man in Brooklyn on Utica Avenue named Shahid Bassel, who my father knew. He was just a guy in the neighborhood. He had, you know, mentally unstable, never a threat to anyone. And my dad saw on the news that a young black guy was shot literally on up the street from my father's store, and he was like, "Are you going?" Because my dad knows who I am. I was like, "Of course I'm going, I'm on the way." And when I get there to the protest that was happening in the streets of Utica Avenue, it was on Montgomery and Utica, and my dad was on Montgomery and Troy Avenue. The minute I get there, all the little boys in the neighborhood are now my age, almost 40. And they were like, "Yo, you Nick's daughter? How's Nick doing?" And the fact that they remembered by seeing me, and remembered who my father is, remembered his name, and remembered to ask about him. And I literally started taking pictures with them and texting them to my dad at home. And my dad's like, "Oh my God, what happened to?" And he's like to ask me about their like kids, and I'm just like, and it was just a beautiful full circle moment for me, just to remember my dad in his totality, just that he was a mentor and father. He didn't have a lot to give as someone who didn't really have an education, but just someone who just loved everybody that came into contact with him.
That's worth more than education and money a lot of times. There's a way that Brooklyn matters in your life. You are like a proselytizer for Brooklyn. There's Jay-Z, there's Biggie, and there's Linda. Why was Brooklyn so central? Why does Brooklyn matter so much in your life?
I want when people think about Brooklyn, like I want them to see me. I love Brooklyn. Like I love Brooklyn like it's a human being. Like I love it so much like it brings tears to my eyes. And I'm one of those Brooklynites. I was born and raised Brooklyn. I still live in Brooklyn. I still live in the same neighborhoods. I worked at the hospital that I was born in. Like it's very intimate community that I'm from. The board chair of the organization that I ran for 15 years is an OBGYN doctor who delivered me when I was a baby in Brooklyn. Like that's how intimate our community is. And Brooklyn for me is a place that really gave me education. Like when we talk about intersectionality and these terms that people hear, I lived intersectionality. I'm a Palestinian, Brooklyn-born, daughter of immigrants, went to an all-black high school. I, went to public school my whole life and was able to interact with people who at some level had relation to me or had aligned with me and some that didn't. And being able to figure out how to navigate my own identity in a place like Brooklyn. Brooklyn is a place where I say where if you can't get to travel and you don't have the resources to travel, just come to Brooklyn. I'll take you to China, I'll take you to Russia, I'll take you to the Middle East, I'll take you to the West African neighborhoods, I'll take you to Harlem. You can experience the world in a place like Brooklyn. And I'm one of the very few Brooklynites who are literally holding on.
Yes.
As much as I can. Obviously gentrification and housing, and it's just not an easy place to stay living in, but I'm just doing everything that I can, even if I gotta keep my kids, poor babies, in this little apartment in Brooklyn. I'm just like, I need you to be Brooklynites like your mom. I'm just gonna have to figure this out.
It's amazing to watch that experience for you, because it's part of it, for me when I read the book, is that Brooklyn shapes in your mind and your consciousness in these really deep cultural ways. But there's also a way that you are prepared for a certain kind of world. Ironically, the kind of world that your critics would say you don't know about, right? Like when you talk about your dad keeping, a little bit of stuff on the shelf so that Orthodox Jews can buy things after the Sabbath, after the sun goes down on Friday, and how you had people of different ethnicities in the neighborhood, different races in the neighborhood, and how your dad doesn't call the police on people if they steal out the store, right? How did Brooklyn, and your childhood, not just Brooklyn, but your childhood, shape your journey to be who you are in the world right now?
I mean, my father definitely played a big role in this. I mean, there's a story that I share in my book, and you don't realize these things till later on when you kind of grow up and then you see how the world is outside of your very sheltered childhood. I shared a story that after school one day I was working at my dad's store. Little black boy comes in, goes to the back of the store, puts a little quart of juice, in his pocket, puts a little quart of cake in his pocket, and he walks out the store. My father knew that he stole, right? And you know me, I'm looking at my father like, what are we gonna do? Like, and my father just chilling, like very calm. And then all of a sudden, I watch him follow this little boy outside, and all of a sudden he calls him by his name. So I'm like, and I was like, I was taken aback that he knew the boy's name. Calls the boy back and said, take the stuff out your pocket. And the poor kid's like, I didn't take nothing. And my father's like, I saw you. Come on, son, take the stuff out of your pocket. So eventually the little boy with tears in his eyes pulls the quarter juice and quarter cake out of his pocket. My dad comes to me, says, give me a paper bag. I give him the paper bag. He puts the stuff in the paper bag. He rolls it up and he says to the boy, your mother works hard. Your mother raised you right. Your mother wouldn't be proud of you for doing that. He said, next time you need to, and he was like, but my mother's at work and whatever. My father said, next time you want something, you ask me. And he just kind of let him go. And in that moment, you don't realize when you're a kid, you're just like, okay, but then when you grow up and then you watch all these things happening around us. And in the same chapter, I share a story of going, I was in high school in Brooklyn. I went to a school called John Jay High School. Ooh. And back in the days, they used to call John Jay Jungle Jay. I went to school in the 90s where there was a lot of gang activity in New York City. And I remember these two kids in my cafeteria fighting. Fighting. We knew, all the kids knew they were fighting over a girl. Next thing you know, before there was the actual school safety officers with guns, which we have in New York City right now, I had NYPD officers in my school before that. And I remember in the cafeteria watching two boys fight over a girl, cops running into the cafeteria, guns drawn, arresting, handcuffs, taking the boys out. Still in that moment, you still don't understand. I didn't have no point of reference. I was the first child to go to high school, so I was like, maybe this is how it is in every high school. I don't know. Maybe this is just how it is. And then when you juxtapose, someone like my father who's like, this ain't really that serious. This is this child is like my child. Like, I'm not trying to call no cops on no 50 cents, worth of. And then you go to a school and these two kids now are arrested. God knows where they are, what happened to them and where they took them. And God knows where their record is and where they are right now. And again, when you grow older, then you realize that I literally was front and center watching school to prison pipeline in Brooklyn, New York, and Park Slope, and watching, my school had bars. Folks remember, if anybody's ever been to public schools back in the 80s and the 90s, I literally remember stop and frisk was in my school. Literally every single morning at John Jay High School, you were stopped and frisked. That's just it. Girls' braids were getting checked. They were telling you to open your mouth because they said kids were bringing blades under their tongues. Like, this is the environment that I grew up in. I was able to experience, by the way, as someone who's not black. Because I was getting stopped and frisked too just because I was a student at the school. But the additional things that I saw, like they didn't have to do that to me. And again, I still don't have a point of reference. I'm still like, this is just probably how it is. Not until you get into the work and start being able to look back and reflect. And my book is a lot about reflection and kind of seeing how what I grew up with reflects to the work that I do. So I feel like, to your point, like I feel prepared to do this work when I started hearing the personal stories as we started doing more, and I got involved in the criminal justice reform field in particular. And I was looking at people like, I saw this. I just didn't know how to articulate it. I knew it was wrong, it didn't feel right, but I just didn't have the words for it.
Yeah. 9/11 happens. It's a normal day for you, kind of, right? You're going to school. And your whole world changes. Why was 9/11 so central to your formation as an activist, as a Muslim, as a citizen? Why did it matter?
We're a country that hasn't yet moved on from the wounds of 9/11. And in fact, continue to shape a lot of our foreign policy and the ways in which we interact with Muslims in this country based on a horrific event that happened 19 years ago. And the story is simple. I'm a New Yorker. Nobody looked at me twice on September 10th. New York is a very diverse city. We have women with hijabs all over the city. Nobody cared. Everything was normal. You went to the supermarket, your neighbors were nice, everything was fine.
And you've been wearing hijab for like 3 years already about that.
Yeah, and my cousins, my family members, we lived in a community where this was normal.
Yeah.
So you go from one day being a regular New Yorker to the day after becoming part of a suspect class, where your neighbors treated you differently, where you walked into a supermarket and people looked at you, they didn't want to be around you, where moms were pulling the kids away from the little Muslim kids at the park. And that already didn't feel right to me.
Yeah.
And it already made you feel a certain way. But I hadn't yet seen what was to come. And just a few Fridays, and I share stories about this in my book, you're at the mosque on Friday, like a lot of Muslims do, and you see women coming to the mosque crying, and they're like, they came, and they took my husband, and another one's like, they took my son, and you know me, I'm this like naive Brooklynite, I'm just like, look, I know bad stuff happened, I watch TV, but what do you mean? So you see them crying, you go up to them, I speak English and Arabic, so I'm able to converse, and I'm like, what do you mean somebody, who took your husband? Oh, I don't know who they were. What do you mean? Were they the NYPD? Were they cops? Well, no, they weren't wearing, police uniforms. And I was like, were they the FBI? We don't know. And so eventually, I remember this very clearly, we take women to go to the imam. They want to see the imam, who's like the religious leader, like the pastor at the church. He's the highest ranking official at the mosque. And I remember my imam at that time, he was an Egyptian guy who just literally was in America for 3 years. He came here on a religious visa to do religious services. And he's listening to these stories and he looks at me and he whispers in my ear and he says, what am I supposed to do? And he looked so helpless, and I was so sad to say, like, even our leaders were not prepared for that moment. And so the things that I saw, Mark, are things like, when I think about them, it brings up a lot of trauma. I was telling Mark and folks back there, backstage, I remember, in New York City, it's Brooklyn, a lot of big apartment buildings. I literally remember raids in my community on apartment buildings where different levels of law enforcement would go into the buildings, and they would literally pull men out from the inside of the building. They would lay them out on the street on their stomachs, like in Brooklyn, New York. And I remember just watching, little kids in the windows, just watching these imagery. And a lot of these folks are immigrants or children of immigrants, and these are people who literally flee police states where this happens under dictatorships and military regimes. And you come to America because there's a promise of America for freedom and to be who you are. And you come here, and all of a sudden, this is what you're experiencing. And that entire promise of a land of freedom and a land that tells you religious freedom is at its foundation, and you find yourself laying on your stomach on the street, not knowing where you were going, where they were taking you, whether you were ever going to see your family again. And those for me were radicalizing moments. I remember, my organization that I started volunteering at the time, I was doing translation, was between two hookah shops. And I remember one night, me and a colleague were walking out of the organization, the I looked out and then I heard I didn't even see yet. I didn't see what was happening. It was dark outside. And I just remember people going, get back inside, get back inside. And I just ran back inside and we locked the doors and I went up to the second floor. I started watching from the window and they were raiding the coffee shops. And the guns were bigger than me. They were like military outside. I'm talking about Southwest Brooklyn. One thing I don't mention in my book is the connection to 9/11 was there was rumors that one of the hijackers of the planes had some sort of relationship to my community, which was absolutely false. And eventually that came out to be false. And so an entire community was being terrorized for something that had absolutely nothing to do with our community. So that for me was one of my radicalizing moments. I was actually a university student. I was studying, my very simple life was this. I watched a movie with Michelle Pfeiffer called Dangerous Minds. And I was like, I'm gonna be a high school English teacher. And I had this dream that I was gonna go back to my old high school and I was gonna, inspire these young people of color and I was gonna get them to express themselves through poetry and writing books and telling their stories. And that was literally it. Summers off, Christmas breaks, I would have the whole thing, be home by 4 o'clock. That was my life. And then the opposite happens, and here I am. So ever since then, my experiences of having to help women find their loved ones in detention centers in Elizabeth, New Jersey. In fact, there was a detention center here outside of Philadelphia, and just having to travel and to find, and then those moments just radicalized me. I was like, this is not okay. And really, the title of my book just speaks to exactly the experience that I had. My title, I could have made my title anything else. But I chose something that I thought would be a call to action to people. Like for me, those moments didn't tell me this is just unacceptable. It put me in a situation where I had to make a decision, and I made the decision that I was not going to be a bystander. I was not going to just sit around and let this happen and just be like, this is just probably how it is. Even if it is how it has been, and people will argue that it's been like this since the founding of these United States of America, but I truly believe that historically and until today, there were always a group of people that said, this is not okay and we're not going to be bystanders, and even if we could make it just a little bit better, just a little bit, that people were willing to do that sacrifice, and I hope that folks join me in that.
And by the way, begin to think about your own questions, because I'm being selfish. I just have so many questions for Linda, but be mindful that there will be a Q&A, and you'll have an opportunity to ask your own questions for Linda very, very soon. You become an activist. You're starting to talk about that moment where you knew you'd be an activist, or really an organizer. It's probably even more central to how I understand who and what you are. When was the moment where you knew this is going to, I'm not getting those summers off and those 3 o'clock breaks?
It started with an individual interaction, and I think that's how a lot of people see me, and they think like I'm still, I try to keep that young vibe, so like I'm like between 2 generations, but I'm actually old.
No, you're not.
I'm old.
You're 16 months younger than me.
Listen, this is what old means to me. There was no Twitter, there was no Facebook.
No cell.
There was there was some people that still had beepers. Like that's what I mean about.
Okay. Aren't we all?
Cell phones weren't as universal, around the 9/11 time. For me, my first interaction was being someone who had not much to give. I didn't even know what I was doing, to be quite honest with you. And I remember, and I shared this story in my book, there was a little Moroccan boy and his mom that came to me at the Arab American Association of New York, which is an organization I had started volunteering at, that was founded by my mentor, who I talk a lot about in the book, who I actually lost in a very grave accident that I never spoke about publicly, and that I shared in my book, and I never went to therapy. And in fact, this was a very therapeutic book for me to share about the woman who really made me the person I am today, who I lost in a tragic accident. In fact, it was in a very tragic car accident, which I was the driver of. So that's just different levels of trauma. And I remember this little Moroccan boy and his mom comes in and she's like, look, they took my husband 5 days ago. I haven't heard from him. I don't know where he is. I don't know where to find him. I don't even know where to start. English is not her first language. And then I see this little boy, and at the time, of course, I had a son and a daughter as well. I had my kids really young, and you have this little boy that looks at you with so much hope in his eyes. And at the end of the conversation, he just says to me, he said, you're gonna find my Baba, right? just with a lot of, and in that moment, there's really nothing else that you can say except, of course I am. Because I had no other choice. And it was that moment for me when I didn't have a lot of resources. We didn't have, believe it or not, Google.com wasn't around either. That's like how old, news time. And I remember being in the yellow pages, I swear to you, we still had the yellow pages out, just calling different attorneys till I found one attorney that told me Brooklyn Law School has an immigration legal services program. They just started doing work around people who were impacted by 9/11, got to them. Make a long story short, we did eventually find this young boy's father. And I remember the day that the father came back with the son, with the wife. They had this little box of baklava that they bought for me as a gift. And I remember that little boy, and I remember him looking at me like, you promised me something and you kept your promise to me. And that was my moment where I was like, this is where I gotta be. Like, my people need me. And I was able to deliver for this little boy. There's probably a lot of little boys and girls that are out here looking for their loved ones. And there was just something so fulfilling about that moment for me. And it was just that small interaction. It wasn't, sometimes people think it gotta be something grand. And it was just a little boy who I promised something to, and I was gonna do everything that I could to make sure that I was able to fulfill that promise. And whatever happened, I don't know how we got to where we got to, but that is what kind of was like, this has gotta be where I gotta be.
Yeah. One of the things that I always appreciate about, or understand about you, is your willingness to keep going even when things are being hurled at you. When you're a public figure and you do the type of work we do, there's a way that people who love you understand you. There's a way that people who love you but don't know you understand you. And then there's a way that people who decide they don't love you or even hate you frame you and understand you. And you have to navigate all those things at the same time. And there have been several moments in your professional career where the Linda that I know and the Linda that your grandma knew is standing on one side. The Linda that brings these people together, we're all on this side. And then there are people on the other side saying Linda hates America. Linda wants to wage war on the American presidency. Linda is an anti-Semite. How does anybody prepare for that kind of resistance, that type of pushback? Because the first time it happens, how do you make sense of it? Like, I'm thinking about how you start the book in particular, with the question that you had. But beyond that, how do you navigate a world where people are committed to misunderstanding?
I mean, I was never naive. I'm a student of history. I know my history. I know the history of this country. I have always been someone who went outside of the curriculum of the New York public school system and actually went and sought my own information. And so I always knew that anybody in this country that stood up for what is right, who went up against the status quo, went up against powerful people, was going to get people who are going to vehemently disagree with me. So I want people to know that I was not going in here being like, everyone's going to agree with me and this is all going to be amazing. So I expected backlash. I expected people to be like, you are wrong. But what I in fact did not expect is I did not expect people who wanted to harm me physically. I didn't expect people who wanted to harm my children. I didn't expect people to mail me things to my home or mail things to my mother. I didn't expect to require security in certain spaces that I'm in. I didn't expect to be so consistently defamed and vilified, almost like on a daily basis. Like my Google alerts are daily. That are such a mischaracterization and misrepresentation of who I am at such a fundamental level. And for me, my resistance comes from a place of like, my people count on me, Mark. And I've gotten to a place where if somebody like me doesn't figure out how to keep going and figuring out how to navigate through that, then the next Muslim activist and young woman is going to say, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to do that. And the point of when people are attacking you in the ways that I've received attacks is exactly that, is to intimidate me, is to silence me. Why? Because I shatter every stereotype. that for years people have propagated this idea that Muslims are some backwards people, that Muslims are, some sort of blight to this society. And here comes this fast-talking Brooklyn Palestinian woman who's intersectional, who sees her liberation bound up with black people, who shows up for different communities, who's progressive and forward-thinking, who's charismatic, who knows how to get messaging out that resonates with people. And all of a sudden, she's infiltrating to them, that's their word. I'm infiltrating spaces and opening people's minds. And that's what we don't want. And so how do you try to get someone like me to go back to a corner somewhere in Brooklyn? Is you try to put my heart in fear. Except I'm Palestinian and I'm from Brooklyn.
You ain't scared of nothing.
I ain't scared of nothing. And I'm also a Muslim. And something that a lot of people don't know about Muslims, and I'm not saying this is also the level of like Iman. As a Muslim, I don't fear people. And in Islam, we have a very simple concept. God, when I was born, God decided for me the day that I was going to die. And so if that means that I'm going to die at an assassin's bullet, I'm ready to go. If that means I'm going to die because I'm going to get hit by a bus, that's how I'm going to go. So my thing is like, I don't have fear. And so that really bothers the opposition. And it actually enrages them. Because they're like, what in the hell do we got to do to this lady so she can just shut her mouth and sit down? And the more I keep talking. For me, all of the greats, and you know this, Mark, I cannot think of anyone that any of you in this room can hold up and say, whether they be people who have fought for rights in this country or people who have fought for rights in other countries, there is not one single human being that I can think of that has ever got up to power and stood up in front of powerful people and said, I'm going to challenge you, that did not get the type of treatment that I got, and in fact got worse treatment than I got. And so for me, I'm just like, look, I'm actually doing pretty well, because I'm still alive.
Right.
And I'm doing okay. I still was able to publish a book. So for me, I have seen things that I do not wish on my worst enemy. And I just want to be clear for folks who haven't read my book, I don't really talk a lot about that in the book. That's not what this book is about. I share a little bit in the beginning just to give you an idea of why I chose to write this book. But this book is not a book of victimhood. I was very clear that when I was going to write a book, that I'm going to write a book where a young Muslim is going to read this book and be inspired and decide also not to be a bystander and be unapologetically Muslim American. And if you're unapologetically Palestinian American and be unapologetically African American, unapologetically LGBTQ, whoever you are, the idea of this book is we will not be silenced, we will not be intimidated, and we will bring our whole selves until this country comes to the day when it comes to terms with the people who live here. Because I say in my book, we have loved this country. Our parents have given everything to this country. Some of our lineages as Muslims goes back to enslaved African people who gave everything to this country. And we have given and contributed to this nation. And one day this nation is going to have to figure out how to love us back in the same way that we love this country. And that's what
Palestine. I don't know if y'all know this, it's controversial. How has your support, not just support, your commitment to Palestinian, not just human rights, but Palestinian liberation, Palestinian freedom, Palestinian dignity and self-determination, how has that shaped the other parts of your organizing and activism? How has that affected how you're understood and also how you navigate all of this?
I mean, when we talk about Palestine, like, it's obviously a commitment, but that's also who I am. So this idea that I'm not supposed to fight for my people is just absolutely ludicrous, like it's ridiculous. Like, what am I supposed to think about what's happening in Palestine? That's like telling Mark, don't care about black people in Philly or black people in Brooklyn. Like, it doesn't make sense what is being asked of people who are Palestinian in particular. For me, when I think about, and that's why a lot of my work has been intersectional, in particular when it comes at the intersections of blacks and Palestinians, is that when I watch the dehumanization of the Palestinian people, the living under a military occupation in a police state, in a place where people by default see you as dangerous and a criminal, is in the same way that we see black people here in America. And for me, I consider myself to be a person that does have a blood of a resistance in my blood. That's where I come from. That's my people. Palestinians have been living under the longest standing military occupation in modern history. And not only is it the longest standing military occupation in modern history, it is paid for by our taxpayer dollars. So when you see a school closing down in Philly, when you see the lack of resources, the lack of clinics and hospitals, but we find trillions of dollars to give to a state that oppresses another people, this is why this cause is ours and all of ours. For us and for me, Palestine is our modern day South African apartheid. So when you look back and I stood up during South African apartheid, we have to be the generation 20 years from now who say, I stood up against the occupation of the Palestinian people. Because what is happening in Palestine is apartheid. It is a separation of two peoples. And a lot of times, when you said controversial, like for me also, the reason why I've gotten so much backlash, I don't even gotta say nothing. I just gotta breathe. The idea that I'm Palestinian is already controversial. I'm gonna give you an example. 2016 DNC convention, Reverend Barber goes up at the DNC convention stage and he says, Jesus was a black Palestinian Jew. That's what Reverend Barber says. Everybody's cool, because that's true, by the way. It's a true statement. Linda last year, Bishop Swan from Boston, was saying something on Twitter. You gotta follow him. He challenges white people a lot, and it's very educational.
And entertaining. And entertaining.
And very entertaining. He's gotten banned before, so now he spells white people in a different way, and it's really good. But it's actually really informative. So anyway, he was trying to make the argument, as many folks of color have, that Jesus is not white. And that in fact, if you ever read the Bible or read any of the books of the Abrahamic faiths, the way that Jesus is described is absolutely clear to me that he's not white. So he was making the argument that Jesus was black. And all I did was, I jumped in to say, just to help reaffirm, I said that we are taught in Islam that Jesus was copper-skinned with woolly hair. Who's copper-skinned with woolly hair? Black people are. So that's a fundamental teaching of how we believe Jesus looked, as Muslims who believe also in Jesus, not as God's son, but Jesus as a very important prophet and figure in Islam. And then I followed up by saying, Jesus was born in Bethlehem. And he is also the Jesus of Nazareth, right? So Bethlehem is in occupied Palestine. Nazareth was part of Greater Palestine. This is all factual statements, people. I wasn't adding some new things. All of a sudden, because when Reverend Barber said it, it was on the highest stage, no one said anything. When the Palestinian was claiming Jesus as a Palestinian, I hit every headline in America. Palestinian activist claims Jesus Palestinian. I swear to God, I was just Google it. Sarsour, Jesus Palestinian. And so for me...
She said he was born in a manger!
And so for me, it's like, it doesn't actually matter what I say. Literally, it just actually doesn't matter what I say. People ask me questions that they think are controversial all the time, and have had to have really hard, deep conversations with Jewish sisters and brothers, particularly those who call themselves progressive Zionists. And they ask me these questions all the time, and I say to people, why can't two groups of people experience things differently? So progressive Zionists will say, Zionism is the plight and self-determination of the Jewish people. Hold that for a second. Zionism for Palestinians means the self-determination, safety, and security of the Jewish people at the expense of displacing, dispossessing the Palestinian people. Who gets to tell my grandmother that also is not a truth? So how is that controversial? That somebody's story matters more than someone else's story. All I'm saying is that my family has a story. that I also have the responsibility to carry a story of my great-great-grand. I'm not trying to take your story away from you. I just want you to respect my story and my experience. I want you to respect my grandmother, who was born in 1927, 21 years before the creation of the State of Israel. Her story matters. She is valuable too. Her lineage is valuable. Her ancestry is valuable too. So this idea of there can only be one story is just not how the world's going to be. And it's not the way that you get to peace, and it's not the way that you get. And you know, the question also, when we talk about Palestine, I talk about this in the book as well. And I try to make it as accessible as possible. What do I believe? I wanted people to read what I believe, because everybody wants to tell people what I believe. I'm going to let you know what I believe. I believe in democracy. I believe in a state, in a democratic state, where Christians, Jews, and Muslims can coexist in peace. I believe that no one community can get security and safety at the expense of someone else's security and safety. Because and there's a quote that I use often, I bring it into a lot of spaces, by an Aboriginal woman named Leela Watson, and she said, "If you have come here to help me, you are wasting your time. But if you believe that your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." And you want to solve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, you have to come to terms that the liberation of the Palestinian people is bound up with the liberation of Jewish people and Christians in that land. And if we can't figure out how everybody gets liberated in that land, then we're going to continue to have a never-ending conflict that is full of violence and full of fueling of hate. Because when one community feels like they can get liberation at the expense of another, and I'm not saying, by the way, Mark knows this because he's been, there is a left, politically left, part of Israel. There are people who say, listen, we are Jews, and we believe in an end to the occupation of the Palestinian people. Nobody wants to tell that story. The human rights activists in New York, you see this here in Philly.
Oh, yeah.
Jewish Voice for Peace. There are Jewish-led groups. In fact, when you go to a Palestinian protest, before I even get there, the Jews are there. They're always there because they be on time.
Yes.
Somebody benefits from not telling those stories. That in fact there is an intersectional commitment to the liberation of the Palestinian people. And so in my book, I actually take you through a very simplified version for people who may never have heard of Palestine and what's happening in Palestine. From my grandmother's story to the Nakba, which is the catastrophe, or what they call the catastrophe.
And your brother's birthday.
And my two brothers' birthdays, because they're
What
both...
are the odds of that?
Both of my brothers are born on May 15, 1990, May 15, 1991. Wow. Which is also the day that Palestinians, so May 14th is when people celebrate Israeli Independence Day, and then the next day Palestinians are mourning what they call the catastrophe, which is when 750,000 Palestinians were displaced on that day. So I take people through that journey in the book.
And it's a wonderful journey, and we get to hear about your family, your grandmothers, your father, your cousins. There's pain in the book, but there's so much joy, there's so much love. It's such an inspirational book. And when I look out here and I see, again, so many people who are inspired by you, who haven't even opened a page of this book yet, it's really a testament to the work you've done, and we're so excited and proud that you're here.